What if I told you that right now, as you're watching this video, there are invisible forces controlling your thoughts, your relationships, and your entire life? And what if I told you that becoming aware of these forces could be the most dangerous thing you'll ever do? Carl Jung, one of history's most influential psychologists, discovered something so unsettling about human consciousness that it fundamentally changed how we understand the mind itself. Jung called it the shadow, and he believed that seeing what others cannot see isn't a gift. It's a curse that could destroy everything you think, about yourself and the world around you. Today, we're diving deep into Jung's most controversial theories about consciousness, perception, and why ignorance might actually be bliss. But first, let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to navigate life effortlessly while others struggle with every decision? Have you ever wondered why certain individuals appear to understand people's motivations before they even speak? Jung discovered that this isn't intuition. It's something far more complex and potentially devastating. Jung spent decades studying patients who claimed they could see things others couldn't. Not supernatural visions, but psychological patterns, hidden motivations, and unconscious behaviors that most people remain completely unaware of. What he found was terrifying. These individuals weren't blessed with special insight. They were cursed with a burden that often led to isolation, depression, and what Jung described as psychological fragmentation. Let's start with the foundation of Jung's theory. He believed that human consciousness exists in layers, like an iceberg. The tip that we see above water represents our conscious mind, the thoughts, feelings, and experiences we're aware of daily. But beneath the surface lies something enormous and largely hidden, the unconscious mind. Jung divided this unconscious realm into two distinct parts. First, there's the personal unconscious, which contains all the forgotten, repressed, or ignored experiences from our own lives. But more importantly, and more dangerously, there's what Jung called the collective unconscious, a shared psychological space that connects all human beings through universal patterns and symbols he termed archetypes. Now here's where things get disturbing. Jung discovered that some individuals develop what he called heightened archetypal awareness. These people begin to perceive the collective unconscious patterns that govern human behavior. They start recognizing the archetypal roles people unconsciously play: the victim, the hero, the trickster, the caregiver. And they see how these ancient patterns manipulate modern relationships and decisions. Imagine being able to look at someone and instantly understand not just their personality, but the unconscious archetypal forces driving their behavior. You'd see their deepest fears, their hidden motivations, and the psychological patterns they're completely unaware of. Sounds like a superpower, right? Jung would disagree. He documented case after case of patients who developed this awareness and subsequently experienced what he called psychological inflation followed by devastating deflation. Initially, they felt godlike, superior to others who remained trapped in unconscious patterns. They believed they had transcended normal human limitations and gained access to hidden truths about reality. But this inflation inevitably led to a crushing realization. The more they could see the unconscious patterns governing others, the more they began to recognize these same patterns within themselves. The shadow they projected onto others turned inward, and they discovered that they too were prisoners of archetypal forces, just more aware of their captivity. Jung observed that this awareness created a paradox he called the curse of consciousness. The more conscious someone became of unconscious processes, the more isolated they became from normal human connection. They could no longer engage in everyday interactions without seeing the underlying psychological mechanics at work. Think about it this way. Imagine watching a movie, but instead of getting lost in the story, you constantly see the cameras, the lighting equipment, and the actors reading from scripts. The magic disappears. The emotional connection breaks. You become an observer rather than a participant. This is what happens to those who develop Jung's heightened awareness. They begin to see the scripts that govern human interaction, the unconscious roles people play, and the archetypal patterns that drive behavior. Romantic relationships become psychological dramas where they can predict every emotional beat. Friendships turn into exhausting exercises in managing others' unconscious projections. Even family dynamics become transparent displays of archetypal power struggles. Jung documented several specific dangers associated with this heightened awareness. The first is what he called psychological voyeurism. When you can see people's unconscious patterns, you develop an almost compulsive need to analyze and understand everyone around you. You become psychologically intrusive, unable to simply accept people at face value. The second danger is projection reversal. Normally, we project our unconscious qualities onto others without realizing it. But when you become aware of this process, you start seeing your own shadow reflected back from everyone you encounter. Every negative quality you perceive in others becomes a mirror showing you aspects of yourself you'd rather not acknowledge. The third danger Jung identified is archetypal possession. When you become too aware of archetypal patterns, you risk being overwhelmed by them. Instead of observing these forces, you begin to identify with them completely. Jung saw patients who became so absorbed in archetypal awareness that they lost their individual identity, believing themselves to be living embodiments of universal psychological patterns. But perhaps the most dangerous aspect of Jung's heightened awareness is what he called the burden of truth. When you can see the unconscious motivations driving human behavior, you're faced with a terrible choice. Do you tell people what you see, potentially destroying their comfortable illusions? Or do you remain silent, becoming complicit in what feels like collective self-deception? Jung worked with patients who struggled intensely with this dilemma. They felt morally obligated to share their insights, but discovered that most people violently reject information that threatens their unconscious psychological structures. Relationships crumbled when these individuals tried to illuminate others' shadow projections or archetypal patterns. Even more troubling, Jung found that people with this heightened awareness often became targets of what he called shadow projection from others. When you can see people's unconscious patterns, they unconsciously sense this and begin projecting their darkest qualities onto you. You become a repository for others' disowned psychological material, carrying not just your own shadow, but the collective shadow of everyone around you. This leads to a phenomenon Jung observed repeatedly in his practice. Those who developed heightened awareness often experienced increasing social isolation, not because they chose solitude, but because others instinctively avoided them. There's something unsettling about being around someone who can see your unconscious patterns, even if they never explicitly acknowledge this awareness. Jung also discovered that this type of awareness comes with severe emotional costs. When you can see the archetypal forces driving human behavior, you begin to understand how much of what we consider personal choice is actually unconscious compulsion. Free will starts to feel like an illusion. Individual personality begins to seem like a thin veneer covering universal psychological patterns. This realization can lead to what Jung called existential despair. If human behavior follows predictable archetypal patterns, if our choices are largely determined by unconscious forces, if our personalities are just variations on universal themes, then what makes us truly individual? What gives life meaning when you can see the psychological machinery underlying all human experience? Jung worked with patients who became so overwhelmed by this awareness that they questioned the value of existence itself. They felt like they were living in a world of unconscious automatons, surrounded by people who were completely unaware of the psychological forces controlling their lives. The loneliness was profound and often unbearable. But here's what makes Jung's theory even more disturbing. He believed that once you develop this heightened awareness, you cannot simply turn it off. It's like learning to read. Once you know how, you can't look at written words without automatically comprehending their meaning. Once you can see archetypal patterns and unconscious motivations, this perception becomes involuntary and constant. Jung called this the point of no return. Patients would often beg him to help them go back to their previous state of unconsciousness, to return to the blissful ignorance they had before developing this awareness. But Jung maintained that consciousness, once expanded, cannot be contracted. The knowledge becomes permanently integrated into your psychological structure. This creates what Jung identified as the fundamental tragedy of heightened awareness. The very thing that seems like enlightenment becomes a prison. You gain understanding of human psychology, but lose the ability to participate naturally in human relationships. You see truth, but can no longer experience the beautiful illusions that make life emotionally satisfying. Jung also observed that people with this awareness often develop what he called compensatory behaviors. Some become compulsive helpers, trying to fix everyone's psychological problems as a way of managing their overwhelming awareness of others' unconscious patterns. Others become cynical observers, withdrawing from human contact to protect themselves from the constant bombardment of psychological information they cannot ignore. Still others develop what Jung called the savior complex, believing that their heightened awareness makes them responsible for enlightening others. These individuals often become teachers, therapists, or spiritual guides, but they struggle with the ethical implications of their knowledge. They know that forced consciousness expansion can be psychologically devastating, yet they feel compelled to share their insights. Jung spent considerable time exploring whether this heightened awareness served any evolutionary purpose. He theorized that throughout human history, certain individuals developed this ability as a way of helping their communities navigate complex social dynamics. These people became shamans, wise women, or spiritual advisors, using their psychological insights to guide others. But Jung also noted that modern society has largely lost the cultural frameworks that once supported individuals with heightened psychological awareness. In traditional cultures, there were established roles and rituals that helped integrate these insights safely. Modern individuals with this awareness often find themselves isolated and unsupported, forced to navigate their expanded consciousness without cultural guidance or community understanding. This brings us to one of Jung's most controversial conclusions. He began to question whether psychological enlightenment was inherently valuable. If heightened awareness led to isolation, despair, and disconnection from normal human experience, was it truly beneficial? Perhaps, Jung suggested, there was wisdom in the unconscious patterns that governed most people's lives. He observed that individuals who remained largely unconscious of archetypal patterns often experienced greater happiness, more satisfying relationships, and a stronger sense of meaning in their lives. Their illusions protected them from psychological truths that could be devastating. Their unconscious patterns provided structure and purpose, even if that structure was largely automatic and unreflective. This led Jung to develop what he called the theory of necessary ignorance. He proposed that human psychology evolved to keep most people unconscious of deeper psychological patterns because this unconsciousness was actually protective. Full awareness of our archetypal nature and unconscious motivations might be too overwhelming for most individuals to handle psychologically. But Jung also recognized that once someone begins developing heightened awareness, attempting to return to unconsciousness is both impossible and potentially even more dangerous. The process of consciousness expansion, once begun, must be seen through to completion, even though that completion might involve accepting a fundamentally different relationship with human existence. He developed therapeutic approaches specifically for individuals dealing with the burden of heightened awareness. These methods focus not on eliminating the awareness, which Jung believed was impossible, but on helping people find ways to live meaningfully despite their expanded consciousness. Jung emphasized the importance of what he called conscious participation in unconscious processes. Instead of standing outside archetypal patterns as a detached observer, he encouraged his patients to consciously engage with these patterns while maintaining awareness of their psychological nature. This approach allowed for both understanding and participation, knowledge and emotional connection. He also stressed the necessity of finding others who shared similar levels of awareness. Jung believed that isolation was one of the most dangerous aspects of heightened consciousness, and he encouraged his patients to seek out communities of individuals who could understand their psychological experience. Perhaps most importantly, Jung taught that heightened awareness came with profound ethical responsibilities. If you could see others' unconscious patterns, you had an obligation to use this knowledge compassionately and respectfully. The power that came with psychological insight could easily become destructive if misused. Jung's final insight about heightened awareness was perhaps his most profound. He suggested that the danger wasn't in the knowledge itself, but in how that knowledge was integrated into one's overall psychological structure. Those who became inflated by their insights, who used their awareness to feel superior to others, inevitably experienced psychological fragmentation. But those who approached their heightened awareness with humility, who recognized that consciousness of archetypal patterns was just another layer of human experience rather than transcendence of human limitations, could potentially find ways to live authentically despite their expanded awareness. The true danger Jung identified wasn't in knowing what others can't see. The danger was in believing that this knowledge made you fundamentally different from or superior to other human beings. The shadow of heightened awareness was the temptation to use psychological insights as a way of avoiding your own human limitations rather than accepting them more fully. Jung's exploration of heightened psychological awareness remains relevant today as more people become interested in psychology, spirituality, and consciousness expansion. His warnings about the dangers of psychological inflation, the burden of truth, and the isolation that can accompany expanded awareness serve as important guidance for anyone seeking deeper understanding of human psychology. The question Jung ultimately posed was not whether heightened awareness was good or bad, but whether individuals developing such awareness could find ways to integrate their insights while maintaining their humanity, their capacity for genuine connection, and their appreciation for the beautiful complexity of unconscious human experience. Perhaps the greatest wisdom Jung offered was recognizing that seeing what others cannot see isn't about transcending human limitations. It's about accepting those limitations more completely while choosing how to respond to the knowledge that comes with expanded consciousness. The danger and the gift exist simultaneously, and navigating both requires tremendous psychological courage, ethical commitment, and perhaps most importantly, genuine compassion for the human condition in all its conscious and unconscious complexity.